Hello and welcome to the presentation. This is one of a series of presentations on Microsoft licensing. Additional presentation in this licensing series can be found at www.learnlicensing.com. Today we'll be talking about Microsoft Virtualization, focusing on server virtualization. We'll first look at the products that deliver on server virtualization, and then review the individual licensing models for each one so that you can ensure you're correctly licensed in your virtualized environment. There are 5 presentations in this series on virtualization licensing, and we'll tell you where to find those at the end of this presentation. Microsoft has virtualization capabilities that go from the data center to the desktop. Let's look at the components that make up the Microsoft virtualization story. The Microsoft virtualization technologies really do go right across an organization, offering 4 main areas of functionality. First of all, there's server virtualization, which allows you to create virtual servers, helping you make better use of your physical hardware. Then there's application virtualization, which helps to combat application complexity, allowing applications to run completely isolated from one another. There's desktop virtualization, which gives IT administrators an easy and centralized way to manage employees' computers. And finally, there's presentation virtualization, which gives high levels of IT control and security when delivering both desktops and applications to users. You may choose to deploy some or all of these virtualization solutions in your organization. Let's look at the technologies you deploy to take advantage of virtualization within your organization. In this presentation, we'll take a look at server virtualization technologies such as Windows Server 2008 Hyper-V. And finally, we'll review Microsoft's management products, an important element in provisioning and managing a virtual infrastructure. A key benefit of these management products is that it's the same set of tools to manage both your physical and your virtual environments with the System Center suite of applications. The focus of this presentation is server virtualization. Let's start off with a quick look at some of the benefits that server virtualization can deliver to an organization. First and foremost, server virtualization allows virtualized guests to run in complete isolation from each other. Problems with application complexity can be overcome without the need to resort to hardware isolation. Instead, complex applications can be run side by side on shared hardware while in perfect isolation. This results in server consolidation, which can help drastically reduce server sprawl. In most cases, enterprises are able to see consolidation ratios in their data centers from 3:1 to upwards of 20:1 or more, while still being able to meet the existing SLAs and performance or throughput needs. This in turn dramatically reduces rack space, power consumption, cooling, and waste, all of which helps businesses cut costs. Of course, in addition to reducing server sprawl and achieving cheaper stability, IT pros are also able to achieve greater flexibility. For example, provisioning can be much easier as organizations simply copy and paste and then modify existing configuration to meet demands for new workloads. Likewise, complex testing and QA tasks can be performed on virtual machines where systems can be backed up through simple file copy operations prior to engaging in any activities that might destabilize the system or produce undesirable results. Let's take a look at some of the technologies that deliver on server virtualization and have a quick review of the evolution of virtualization. So with a Windows Server 2003 environment, Virtual Server 2005 sat on top of Windows, and then the virtual server sat on that infrastructure running the required applications. With the launch of Windows Server 2008, it is possible to continue using the virtual server product with virtual machines in the same way. From a licensing point of view, Virtual Server 2005 is now a free download, and there are no licensing implications with this product. With the Windows Server operating system, the licensing requirements are that each physical or virtual machine has its server operating system correctly licensed. We'll talk more about this shortly. Users accessing the services on these servers also need to be correctly licensed with client access licenses, known as CALs. For the server applications running in the virtual machine, the same licensing requirements apply to these products as if they were running on physical machines. The server product needs to be correctly licensed, and where appropriate, the users accessing these servers need to be appropriately licensed. With the introduction of Windows Server 2008, a new type of Microsoft virtualization technology was introduced, a hypervisor. Let's take a look. Hypervisor virtualization is how the market is moving. The Microsoft hypervisor, Hyper-V, is actually built into the operating system and so works faster and more efficiently. When should the new Hyper-V be used versus Virtual Server? Windows Server 2008 enabled with Hyper-V virtualization technologies may only be run on 64-bit versions of Windows Server 2008 and on hardware that supports hardware-assisted virtualization. If you have a 32-bit environment, you should continue to use Virtual Server. Note that the file formats of the virtual machines are the same, so you will find it easy to migrate when you upgrade your hardware. Also note that the licensing considerations are exactly the same whether you're using Virtual Server or Hyper-V within Windows Server 2008. You may be aware that there are different editions of Windows Server 2008 operating system: Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, and Data Center Edition. Traditionally, editions were differentiated with functionality such as scalability and performance. However, virtualization is also a consideration when choosing the right edition of Windows Server for your business. Let's take a look, starting with Windows Server 2008 Standard Edition. Here we have Windows Server 2008 Standard Edition. The first point is that Windows Server 2008 license that you acquire is considered to be attached to the hardware, and that the license confers rights as to what you are covered to do with virtual machines on that server hardware. When you're working with server applications, you can choose to run those server applications either in a physical operating system environment, sometimes called a POSE, or a virtual operating system environment, a VOSE. The licensing rights for Standard Edition gives you the rights to run applications in either the POSE or the VOSE. If you choose the virtual environment, then you may use an additional physical environment to manage that virtual environment. Virtualization with Standard Edition may not be the most cost-effective choice, given that when you want additional virtual machines on this physical hardware, you will have to purchase additional Windows Server licenses. Let's take a look at Windows Server Enterprise Edition virtualization from a licensing point of view. Enterprise Edition gives you the rights to run applications in up to 4 operating system environments. You could choose to run applications in the physical operating system environment and another 3 virtual operating system environments, or to run only applications in up to 4 virtual operating system environments and to use the physical operating system environment to manage the virtual operating system environments. Enterprise Edition licenses can be a good choice since one license gives inclusive rights to run applications in up to 4 operating system environments. Now let's look at even more extensive virtualization rights solutions. Data Center Edition is the ultimate edition if you intend on virtualizing extensively. Data Center Edition gives you the rights to 1 physical and unlimited virtualized environments. I mentioned near the beginning of this session that machine virtualization can enable great benefits for IT. Let's see how the licensing of Windows Server 2008 really does enable that. We said that a Windows Server 2008 license is assigned to the physical hardware. To add some detail to that, licenses acquired through volume licensing can be reassigned to another server every 90 days or in the event of permanent hardware failure, while Windows Server 2008 original equipment, or OEM licenses, acquired with hardware cannot be reassigned. A Windows Server license gives rights to a number of instances of Windows Server running in virtual machines on the physical hardware. There are no limits to the number of stored, non-running instances that can be stored on any licensed server device, and running instances can be moved between licensed server to maximize license usage. So, if you are running Windows Server 2008 Enterprise Edition on your server, you could move loads to other licensed physical servers, depending on hardware usage, to a maximum of 4 virtual machine instances running at any time on the servers, unless you own additional licenses. The licensing for Windows Server 2008 has flexibility of downgrade rights. You may run an instance of an earlier version of Windows Server. Let's look at an example of this practice. Let's say you've purchased Windows Server 2008 Data Center license and assigned it to a piece of server hardware. You have the right to run Windows Server 2008 on that hardware. However, by exercising your downgrade rights, you could choose to run Windows Server 2003 R2 or even Windows Server 2008 in a physical environment and Windows Server 2003 R2 in a virtual environment on the same piece of hardware. These are just 2 of the many scenarios enabled with the licensing rights for Windows Server 2008. And finally, we will look at a scenario where you may have acquired an edition of Windows Server 2008 and want to run an alternative one. As we talked about earlier in this session, there are different editions of Windows Server 2008, including Standard, Enterprise, and Data Center editions. The Windows Server 2008 licensing rights provide that you may deploy a different edition of Windows Server with certain additions. Let's take a look at some of the many possible examples. With an Enterprise license, you may deploy the Enterprise edition on your server hardware. However, if it's more appropriate, you may alternatively choose to deploy the Standard Edition. With the Data Center Edition license, you have further flexibility. You can choose to deploy either an instance of Standard or Enterprise in its place, or deploy the Data Center license in the physical environment on the server, and then perhaps an Enterprise Edition in a virtualized environment on that server. Each of these is dependent on your environment, but there are other scenarios that you can take advantage of. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are 4 other presentations covering the other aspects of Microsoft Virtualization licensing: Presentation Virtualization, Application Virtualization, Desktop Virtualization, and Virtualization Management. You can find these presentations at www.learnlicensing.com. You'll also find an accompanying downloadable quick reference card outlining the major principles of this presentation and a resource list to get more information related to this topic. Look here too for additional licensing presentations covering licensing principles and in-depth product licensing models. Thank you for joining this presentation on the licensing of Microsoft Server Virtualization technologies.